Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on the bottom of page 1355. Aleph Shinun Hey. Actually, my mistake. No. Bottom of page 1357. Aleph Shinun Zayin. Actually, again, third mistake. The top of 1358. Yeah. That's correct. 1358. We're ahead of where I thought we were. Okay. The discussion overall is about Mashpia Mekabel. The classic example, the sun and the moon, Zon Malchus. But we already learned that in Mekabel, in the recipient, there are three forms of Mekabel, the energy of a recipient. The moon, Malchus, is compared to the moon, compared to a bright stone, and to eyesight, to the vision and sight, which is also a form of light. And each of them are a recipient in a different way. We're going to get back to it later. But that was discussed earlier, all part of the discussion of light and darkness in general, which is the whole purpose and the interface theme of Ayin Beis, transforming the darkness of existence into light, into divine awareness and consciousness. But as we've also learned, it's not just awareness. The very darkness of existence also is rooted in levels that are higher than divine revelation. So there's divine revelation and expression, then there are levels that are higher than expression and revelation, and that's where the very concealment is rooted, and that's also part of the transformation. Recognizing that, that's called the Helama Atzmi. But the main focus has been, the real work is step by step, as we illuminate our existence, our life. How do we illuminate it? By bringing in, through Aveda, through our work, even though initially the world is shrouded in darkness, but through our contemplation about godliness and our emotional, we become more and more aware, and slowly we acclimate the containers that even in a dark world, we begin to recognize godliness, and we climb that ladder higher and higher, to the point that the light is shining through the concealment even, and to the point that the very root of the concealment is also revealed, that it's rooted in the core concealment of Helama Atzmi. We learned at length earlier. After finishing the discussion how this is done Mata Lamaila, from the bottom up, primarily through prayer, through tefillah, that we elevate Elakai HaMelech, godliness, as is manifest in Malchus, Elakai HaMelech, Elakim in Melech and Melech. Aremimcha, we elevate it from the bottom up, from the Yesh to the Ayin, to the point of transforming the very darkness as well. On all the levels we learned, if you remember the three different levels of sweetening the Gvura, sweetening the bitter waters, by either by neutralizing it through more chesed, or by transforming it through chesed, or by transforming it from the Gvura itself. So then he went and said, what about Mamayla Lamata? Then he started, let's talk Mamayla Lamata Torah. So on top of page 1350, he began, now we have to understand Torah. Torah draws down from the top down, where we get a vision, a perspective of existence through God's eyes. That can only be through Torah, because everything else is through our eyes. Even when we daven, it's through our eyes. It's through our experience. We request based on our needs. Torah, God revealed himself to us through Torah. He revealed his wisdom. He revealed his will. He revealed his wishes, his mitzvahs, and the whole blueprint that the Torah provides us. That's Mamayla Lamata Torah Oyer. So in explaining that, he began to talk about the comparison between Torah and Neshamis. Both are called Oyer. As he said, both are called Odom, actually. They're both called Yisrael, is called Odom. and Torah is called Adam. And you have to understand what is the difference between the Tzir Adam of Neshama and the Tzir Adam of Torah. Another comparison is with mitzvahs, and neshamas are also called Ner. Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. The fire, the flame, the candle of God is the soul of a human being. Ner mitzvah, b'Torah, and a mitzvah is compared to a candle as well. So he explained what that candle represents, the three components of how the divine soul manifests inside the body and the animal soul. That's the wick. The oil is the chachma, the wisdom, and the personality of the animal soul, which turns into fuel that the wick is, that feeds the wick, turning into an oil, into a flame. Both Anashama does that and mitzvahs does that, as he explained on page 1350 and on. Now, though he didn't say it explicitly, it's pretty clear that Torah oil is a higher level than Ner. Ner, you're working mamata lamailo, or even if it's not completely from the bottom up, but you're working with an animal soul. The divine, the Torah is coming from the top down, Torah. So though he didn't explicitly state it, it's pretty clear. You can extrapolate what the kavanah is. That's the that's created, the of Torah. Okay. To explain that, the Rebbe Rashab said, "V'nirali levayir ha'inyan." On page 1352, according, what is Eir HaRiyah? That Riyah, on one hand, the eye sees. On the other hand, it cannot see without the help of a mashpia, of the sunlight or of candlelight, as he explained. In contrast to the moon does not see, but the moon reflects the sunlight, as well as a bright stone also retains the personality, it assumes the personality of light, as he explained the differences, as I mentioned before. We're going to get back to that. So that's what he talked about on page 1352, 1353, and on 1350 and 1350 through 15.5, and on 1355, the Rebbe Rashab went now, Dugma Mikol Zeh is Zoh and Malchus, Mashpia and Makabel, and the key thing to remember is that they're different. The mashpia, Zoh, that the world was created even before the diminishment of the moon in a structure of give and take of a mashpia and a makabel. So it's not due to any diminishment. That's the way, even when Shnei Ma'eres Hagdelim, Malchus receives from Zoh. It's bederech ma'ivir, because in the beginning it was it's received kesed echad l'shneim, one crown, teferes of ima of bina, that goes to both, but it travels through Zoh. L'ashad will be a higher level where Zoh will, Malchus will receive straight from Bina, and even higher, as we learned. So that's Mashpia and Makabel. Now, what's the difference in a Mashpia and a Makabel? He said two things. Mashpia is revelation, it's a revealer, and a Makabel is a concealer. That's one difference between Zoh and Malchus. The second is the Mashpia is Mashpia Atzmi, Atzmi, he called it. The mashpia atzmi v'tivi, and the makabel who ena atzmi, which means, as he explained on page 1356, that the mashpia does not need extra work to be a mashpia. Yes, he has to work to choose to be a mashpia, but you don't need to turn him into a mashpia. The keli, on the other hand, has to be made. Even though he's potentially a keli, but it has to be shaped into a container. And he said two ways that a teacher does that. Either through refraining, so it causes the student to long for the learning, to receive from the mashpia, or by overwhelming him, and that causes him to work to become a keli. Like he said, it refines him. Okay. The second difference is that the mashpia is mashpia from what he has. He fundamentally has it, and he doesn't need an outside force to give it to him. It comes from his own koyach, his own power to be mashpia, as well as that what he's mashpia is also coming from within himself. The makabel, both the power to transmit and what to transmit, he receives from the mashpia, as he explained on the top of page 1357. And then he said, to understand this, he went back to Malchus. That Malchus, it says in Zayar, doesn't have any energy of its own, has no lesla megamot klum. there are two meanings in that, and both are true. One is it doesn't have anything on its own; it receives its light from the mashpia zah. The other is the other way around. Malchus receives from the am, from the people below, from the aveda of neshamis and malachim. And he said both interpretations are true, and he's going to explain that soon. Now, to understand that, he went into the very dynamics to dissect the anatomy of how Zah and Malchus were created. So the Kisra Arizal says, briefly, we're summing up now what we learned on page 1357, catch up to where we are, that the Gimel Rishonis Moichin, he says, are Netzal, all 10 spheres. They're complete entities. Zah, in Shadish, beside Shadish, its root core is only the 6 facets of Chesed, Gvura, through Malchus, through Yesod, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Yisei, Vav K'tzavos. And the fact that it has Gimel Rishonis Meichin, that's beside Tesfus. That's like an add-on. That's an add-on. That's added on. And he explained either through Avodah or through natural growth. But it's not the core way Zoh was created, emanated. Malchus is even lower. Malchus emanated only as a nekuda, as a point, a dot. It has no gili at all. And the 9 spheres within it, all of them are b'tzei tesvis that come through Aveda, through the work that we fill up Malchus, as we discussed at length, the Aliyas HaMalchus, through our Aveda. That's what he said on page 1357. And now he's explaining, or middle of understanding, what is this nekuda of Malchus? Yeshlemer, he said, that with Malchus, Netzol Raka Nekuda Achas, is because Malchus is rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, which more specifically is a Radlo, the top of Kesed, Atik, that's higher than Gilui. So how does Malchus emanate? When it originates from a place that's higher than Gilui, so when it comes down below, it's below Gilui. There's no Gilui. It's a Nekuda Achas. Zoh is 6 facets. There's a structure to it. There's a revelation to it. There's a expression. And that's rooted in a lower level. So Nekuda of Malchus is rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, broadly meaning with Shesh Malchus Radla, and the Tesfir Salyenis in it are from Arich Ampin. And that's higher than Gili. Mereish Mekedem Nesucha, he explained. Mereish is like Arich. He didn't say it explicitly. Is Reish Mokrish Talslos. Well, Mekedem is even earlier, prior to that, is Actualize Nasa and Shalamal Gamchin's Mokrish Talslos. And it's in a form of Nesucha. It flows, like it pours. When you pour something, it's not just a reflection, the very essence comes into the Nekuda of Malchus. And that's Seif Maisa b'Machshavet Chila, the end of the whole structure, which is Malchus, is rooted in Machshavet Chila, which is not just Chila Samachshaveh, like he said, not just the beginning of thought, higher than thought. In other words, Machshavet Chila higher than Gili. And that's why it's a Nekuda. What is this in the root of roots? On top of page 1358, he said that is Helama Atzmi of Ein Sof, that Malchus is rooted all the way in that level of Atzmus, and that's why it comes like a Nekuda, which is a state of Helam. In other words, for something to be concealed below, it has to come from a place that's higher than revelation above. So you could say Helam in 2 ways. It's higher and precedes any form of conscious aware and revelation and expression, or it's lower than expression by being concealed. But the concealment below is rooted in the concealment above. Okay. The next section, which I'm going to go over now, even though we began learning it, I'll read it again now slowly, a little more. We'll go over on the top of page 1358, line number 2. Before I continue, I just wanted to give a few sources here. The concept of Lesla Megarmok Klum, that Malchus has nothing of its own, and the 2 interpretations, is based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe that he said, Pesach time, Tovkuf Samach Gimel. So that would be, Tovkuf Samach Gimel would be 1803, is Tovkuf Samach Gimel. So 1803, Pesach time, the Shabbos before Pesach, and then Pesach, Chalamoid Pesach. And that Maimer talks about these two meanings in Nasr Magam Oklum. That Maimer then became a longer Maimer by the Mittler Rebbe in Teres Chaim B'Shalach. And some that learned in Derech Mitzvah Secha from the Tzemach Tzedek, you can find the Maimer also. There's a Maimer called Lahavin Inya Pesach Umatzah. That's the Maimer. Another name for the Maimer is Malchus Malchus Kol Elamim. But bottom line, he talks about Malchus and these two interpretations and explains how both of them are right and they're interdependent in the Maimarim I just referred to. The piece about Malchus emanating as a Nakuda, as a point, and by extension, there's an add-on of the 9 spheres, that's based on Biyuri Hazeya Bolok from the Mittler Rebbe, and especially the Tzemach Tzedek as he elaborates on it. That's just sometimes I give the sources when I look them up, and it's very interesting to compare that to here, but it's essentially based on those Maimor. So with that said, and all the sources that he brings here, Mavi Sha'arim from Ikisa Rizal, that Tzemach Tzedek brings as well. So a lot of it is taken straight from there. So
where
now,
is the Tov Kuf Samach Gimel? This is a sefer for itself.
There's a series called Maimori Admura Zokin Tov Kuf Maimori Admura Zokin. It goes by the years. It starts with Tov Kuf Samach Beis, Samach Gimel, Samach Dalet, Samach Hey. It's a set printed today. You have the set?
Thank you.
Yeah, so you can find it there in Tavkuf Samach Gimel. In Derech Mitzvah Secha, it's the mitzvah called Pesach HaMatzah, Loving in Pesach HaMatzah. There, at the end of the Maimon, it says it wasn't completed. But if you look at the other Maimonim I just referred to, there, it's there at pretty much at length, especially in Teres Chaim. There he elaborates. Very fascinating Maimon. Okay. So being that, I'm going to go over now, if you go to page 1358, we're on line 2. I'm going to start from line 2. Even though we read it, we'll read it again a little slower, and I'll explain. And so the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. And here we are, line 2 and 1358, Aleph Shin Nun Ches. So after saying that Malchus in its root of roots is rooted in Helam Ha'atzmi, Al-Kain Atzilus HaMalchus M'chinas Nekuda Achas. The Nekuda M'chinas Helam. What's a Nekuda? A Nekuda is like a seed. It's a kernel. It's a concentrated point that can have a lot in it, but on a reveal level, it's not revelation. Letter Hey, for example, if you talk about the Hebrew alphabet, the Yud always focuses on concealment, concentrated. The Hey is expansive. The Vav extends. Every one of the Hebrew letters, also in their shape, teaches us things. Now, the Hebrew language is not just the letter, the meaning of, it's not just the letter as it makes up part of a word. It's also the gematria of the letter. Every letter has a number corresponding to it. It's also the shape of the letter. It's also the number, the number, the shape. Yeah, so all of that is significant. So the Yud always symbolizes a Nekuda. Hey symbolizes expansion. So Yud and Hey would be Chachma and Bina, for example, very often. But regardless, in this case, we're talking about the Nekuda of Malchus, like a Yud and Nekuda, and that Nekuda is a B'chinas Hela. So now, Ukamashikosa b'Zoyar Bereshis. So now he brings a Zoyar Bereshis, Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, Al Pasuk Vayivan Es Hatzela, and I'll go over it again. We learned this. Vayivan Es Hatzela is that God built the Tzela, the side of Adam. He took a Tzela, and from that Tzela he built Chava. He built a full structure. Now, of course, this is clear, Malchus, because Malchus is Nekeva. So we see the building of Malchus, basically. The Inyan Selu who Kameshikosa Shchirani Venova. The Tzela is referring to what it says in the Pasuk, Shchirani, I am dark but beautiful. I am dark and beautiful. What does dark imply? A Nekuda, Helam. But it's beautiful. So he's going to explain what that means. The Isa b'Sefer Hadras Melech, the Sefer Hadras Melech, which I think Shlomo Bugazilu is the author. I mentioned he's the compiler at least. It's taken from it's taken from the commentary of that Arizal, but it was put into a sefer with Simonim. So Simon Kuf Lamed Zayin, what does he say in Sefer Hadis Melech? B'Shem HaRamaz, the name of Rav Moshe Zakuto was a very famous Makubal, student of the Arizal, Guri Arizal, and he wrote famous commentary on Zoyar. Anyway, he says B'Shem HaRamaz. What does he say? The B'Yesa Malchus B'Seid Nekuda Achas.
Ramaz was a student of the Arizal or student
of a student, not direct student. The main student of that Arizal was Rab Chaim Vital. There were other students, of course, but the people who were makabel from Rab Chaim Vital is the Ramaz, the Tzemach. You know, there's a whole. It's written up all the different generations. And they're the ones that compiled the Kisvei Arizal and published it. The students of the students. Rav Chav, remember, took all the writings of that Arizal and was buried with him. It was his son had to be mater neder and open up the grave to take out the ksavim. Rav Chav buried all the Kisvei Arizal with him in his grave, and it was Rav Shlomo Vital, Rav Chaim's son, that made a whole bezdin to take out those writings. That's how we have the Chidah in his famous sefer on Svarim and Machabrim. What's the name of this? He writes about it.
Shem Agdolim?
Shem Agdolim, yeah. He writes a whole thing. I think it's on either Rab Chaim Vital or Shlomo Vital, or maybe even Arizal. He writes the whole parsha, how they found the writings and how they published them. That's why when you look in Eitz Chaim, you'll see Hagos Tzemach, you'll see all kinds of different names, because these were the people who took the writings and they published them and organized them. Okay. So what does he write? B'Shem HaRamaz, the B'Yes HaMalchus B'Seid Nekuda Achas, that being that Malchus is in the Soid, as we said, it's in the, what do we say? The doctrine, its form of expression is Nekuda Achas, Hainu Hanukuda Hashroshi Shabo Abchinas HaKeser. Like we said before, its very root, its kernel, the seed, the shadish, the root of Malchus is a Nakuda, which is what? The root core, which is the level of Keser. He said that at the bottom of the previous page. That it was Hua Kesher Shabbat. Oz Nikre Tzela. Then it's called Tzela. V'oz Hishcheda Mamish. When it's just a Nakuda, it's called Tzela. That's the name for it. Even though Tzela means a side or means a rib, as we said. And then it's in a state of Shcheda Mamish. It's a state of dark. It's in a dark state. It's not yet been developed into anything. That's why the Eibishter had to build it. He had to build it out. So even though Zochen Nekeva Bara Esam, the God created male and female, but it still says V'yikach achas mitzlo Esav. He took one of the tzlo Esav, one of his sides, and he ve'ivan, and he built it out. So the tzela on its own is still in a state of concealment. That's Malchus in the state of a Nekudim. Aval Nikra Nava, but it's called beautiful. Ki yechele Nekuda Zu Lamed Ponim Beponim. That's the second part. Why is it called beautiful then? Because this Nekuda has the power, the capacity to stand Ponim Beponim, meaning face to face with the Zohar, with the male, which is Zoh.
Lami Tomid Pon Befonim.
That's the next line. You skipped a line. You see? You skipped a line. You're reading the next line. I'm reading the line above it. To stand face to face. And when it's face to face, like the moon and the sun, when they're face to face, there's a gilui. So even though it is in its own state, in a state of darkened state, atzela, but it has the capacity panim beponim, kenisker b'priyetz chaim b'krish mishalamita. Like he mentions in Priyetz Chaim, in the kavanas of Krish mishalamita and the evening pray in the evening Shema, the bedside Shema. At kan l'shene. So this exact language of the Sefer Hadas Melech, where he explains Malchus and the Tzela and the dark, but the beauty is its capacity to stand in full glory, panim b'panim, with Zah. That's what the Sefer Hadas Melech says, and the Rebbe Rashab is obviously bringing it here in context of Malchus. So Malchus on its own is a nekuda, it's in a darkened state, but it has the capacity. And that's why Shcheirani V'nava. I'm dark, but beautiful, and beautiful. But let's continue reading, and then he's going to bring more sources for this. But Ayin Sham Seif Perek Daled, the Rebbe Rashab is now referring us to the end of the chapter 4 in where? In Priyetz Chaim that he just cited. He said, look in Priyetz Chaim Kshar Krishma Shalamita. So there, in Priyetz Chaim, the end of chapter 4, he says like this, the Nekuda Yechel Lamed Tamid Ponim B'Ponim Imzah. So as the Sefer Hadas Melech from the name of the Ramaz quotes, he's actually citing that in Priyetz Chaim he says, that this Nekuda, this point of Malchus, can stand always, permanently, face to face with Zah. In Sefer Hadas Melech, he didn't mention Tamid and he didn't mention Zah. In Priyetz Chaim, in the original, where he's citing from, he spells out exactly the pictures. The Rebbe Rashab is just being very thorough in explaining what this level is like. And he goes further, more sources. Look there. Their Shara Kavonis is usually it's a separate sefer from that Izal, Shara Kavonis. So why does it mean Sham? Maybe in Priyetz Chaim there's also a Shara Kavonis. All of it is Kavonis. Anyway, but look there, Shara Kavonis, Ubeshara Tfilin Drush Hey. In Priyetz Chaim or in Shara Kavonis, there's a Shara Tfilin, chapter 5. Ubeshar Rosh Hashanah Drush Aleph. He's continuing with the sources. If I recall correctly, most of these sources are in the Tzemach Tzedek's Biurei HaZeyar. So now he quotes one more from the Arizal. Ubeshar Rosh Hashanah Drush Aleph, and the gate called the gate of Rosh Hashanah in the first drush, in the first discourse, Muvan Shazel Mepnei Shibchinis Keser. It's understood. Why does Malchus have is this state that on one hand it's an akudah, but on the other hand it has the capacity to stand face to face, because it has keser within it, Malchus. And since it's the level of keser, so it has that capacity that even though it's just an akudah, to stand face to face. I think that's what he's trying to say. The chenu behedya. And that's how it's actually written, B'shara Kavonis or B'shara Tfilin Sham. I know what he means. I am Mashakos Sham. Let me just explain. In the Kisra Arizal, there's a different svarim. We mentioned so far Movei Sha'arim in the previous page. There's Priyetz Chaim. There's also what's called the Shemeina Sha'arim, the 8 gates. And one of them is called Shara Kavonis. What he means, Sham, I Mashakos Sham. So just as in Priyetz Chaim, there's the kavonis around the bedtime Shema. The same is correct with Shar Kavonis. There's also a section on Krishma Shalamita. So he probably means that there too it talks about it, and he says, and actually in Shar Kavonis and Shar Tfilin, he actually says that this is due to the Keser. The Keser, the Yeshlemer canal. And the Rebbe Rashab is now going to explain what does that mean. Yeshlemer, we can say, as mentioned before, being that Malchus is rooted in Keser, which is on the highest level of Atzmus, Al kain b'yecholta lamed ponim b'ponim im b'china zah. That's why it has the capacity to stand face to face with the level of zah. In other words, in Pri Etz Chaim, in the sources, it doesn't say exactly why. It just says because it's coming from Kesed. But what's the explanation? Is because Kesed is rooted in the Atma. That's why it's rooted on such a high level. That's why it can stand face to face with Zah. Okay. So let me explain in simple English what he's saying here. The Rebbe Rashab is coming to elaborate upon is that even though in the structural dynamics of how Hishtalshelus was created, Malchus is the lowest of the 10 spheres, and Lesla Megama Klum, it has nothing of its own, it's a Nakuda. It's concealment. Its revelation is going to come either from the Shemesh, either from Zah, or from the Aveda below. But on its own, Malchus is a Nakuda. And yet, in that Nakuda is rooted all the way in the highest levels, in Keser, Radlah, and all the way to Elam Atzmi, Atzmus Ein Sof. So Malchus has all that within it. And that's why he says Malchus has the capacity. It doesn't begin that way, but it has the capacity to stand full stature, face to face, at the same level as Zah, because Malchus is rooted even higher than Zah. That's what it looks like he's saying here. So bottom line, he's explaining the paradox of Malchus. On one hand, has nothing of its own. On the other hand, it's rooted in these highest levels, and that's why it ultimately can stand ponim b'ponim with the level of Zah. Now, the question is how we get to that place. So we're going to learn that's our avodah. I discussed at length in one of the previous classes that Malchus represents everything that we are about. On one hand, the Jews, Yisrael, Damon L'Levana, Umein L'Levana. The Jewish people are compared to the moon, and we count by the moon. We sanctify it, and we count. Our months are dependent on the moon cycles. Why? Because the moon represents life. On one hand, it waxes and wanes. Life is never steady. It's not like the sun, a steady light. It's far more like the complexity of the moon, like a makabel. So it could wax and grow, and then it wanes to the point of a dot. In its root core, it's in a state of concealment. But it can be built out, and when you build it through Aveda, when we work, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Beis Hamikdash represents Malchus. Chet Tzadas caused the Shechina to rise from the Oretz. Oretz is Malchus. So all the transgressions in history, all were at the expense. What ultimately they caused was the diminishment of Malchus, and our Aveda is to make Malchus grow and become bright. That's our Aveda, the tikkun of the Levana, and as we do so, the Levana has the capacity to reach levels, very high levels, because it's ultimately rooted in the highest level of all. But it's still a state of concealment. That's why you need the Aveda to reveal it. Now, how is it going to be revealed? It's going to be through the Mashpia, but it's also through our Aveda. Remember, both interpretations are true. What Malchus has nothing of its own without Zah and without our Aveda. He's going to explain how both are needed. But bottom line is Malchus has on its own, it's a dark state, but it's Venava, it's Shcheda, dark, but it's beautiful because it has that capacity and ultimately can stand side by side with Zah. And as we learned, it actually is Mashpia into Zah. He's not talking about that right now. He's talking now standing face to face. So even though initially it begins, like I said, in a Kuda, but it has the capacity to grow and stand ponim b'ponim tamid. Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah, I don't understand how Malchus is a Nakuda and nothing in it, dark, and then it became a Tzela. But the Adam and Chava were both, Chava was created, it just was facing away from Adam, right? The backside, but it didn't start out as, she wasn't a Nakuda. She was as I understand it, she was created as a full human being, just back to back, and then they take the cell out, but it wasn't a Nakuda to begin with. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, first of all, let's talk about an Ruchnius. He's talking a Zohar Malchus. He's not talking actually a physical being yet. In Zohar Malchus, the energy of Malchus is a Nakuda. So even though Chava or the Nekeva was, yes, back to back and a full entity, but her energy was one of Helam, not of Gili. A Zohar, like he said, the difference between Zohar and Malchus is the Mashpia and the Makabel. So it's not about what you see. It's what is the essential feminine energy is an internal intimate energy that's concealed, like Malchus. So practically speaking, what happened was, and this is different opinions in the Gemara, Zochar Nekeva, yes, an androgynous creature. And in Ruchnius, it makes complete sense because God had to build it out. Because then the question is, what's Vayivan? On the Pasuk, it says he had to build it out. Why did he have to build it out? She was there already. All he had to do was separate them. Because even though he had to separate them, and technically it was a separation, but it was also building her out that she should be a full-blown entity in the fullest sense. And that only happens through the Eira Mashpia, not through the Eira Makabel. That's why it also explains, at the end of the day, why did she come from Adam? Why didn't Adam come from her? Or rather, both of them came from one entity. Because even when Malchus in his fullest glory still needs to receive through Zav. That's the way God created the Mashpia Makabel. Not due to any fault of anybody. It's just the way it works. So you have to remember that the woman is more than just a physical woman. It's a feminine energy, which is a Malchusdika energy, in contrast to the hashpa, the transmission, the transmittable energy of the masculine. To put it in different terms, masculine energy is expressive energy. Feminine energy is intimate energy.
Abalasi Loveway, it's going to be the higher, because the Helam Atzmi is having higher than any revelation.
We learned that, yes, we learned that. But before you get to that, we first need Malchus to grow from Biti to Achesi to Imi. There's levels. Malchus has many levels to grow. First, that you want it to be equal to the sun before you go greater than the sun.
What's intimate energy mean exactly?
An energy that you can't see in a revealed way. It's a much more internal one. Every human being has both energies. There's the energy when you express yourself in an aggressive way. This is what we learned earlier, the power to reveal. And then there's the power to not reveal. That's also an energy. That's actually a more intimate energy. It's an energy, the things you can't express, but they're fully there. We say Kfuda Bas Melech Pnima, the glory of the princess is within. So we live in an external world where in this material world, we value outer expression, superficial stuff. That's why male energy seems to be more powerful. But it's feminine energy that's far more powerful because it's internal and intimate, but it's not appreciated. When you look at somebody, what is the thing we're most impressed by? The outer looks, the superficial look. That's expressive energy. Intimate energy is the part of the person that's not seen, that remains within. Like he says, Shcheirani, I am dark, but I'm beautiful. We don't see, in darkness, we don't usually see beauty. We don't see anything, actually.
And this is also the energy that is allowing the muscular energy to be revealed. The Helam.
It goes both ways. The masculine energy's role is to help nurture and cultivate and reveal the power of Malchus, and then Malchus in turn. Think of a teacher and a student type of thing. But you have to keep in mind, Eir Makabel is not inferior. They're both created. They're both Shnei Ha'Ma'eres Hagdelim. They're both luminaries. They're just different type of luminaries. Physically speaking, based on the Gemara, that's why there are two opinions. Tzela, Sla'esav, one opinion is a rib. Now, a rib doesn't have a structure. If Chava was like a rib, not like a side, that makes sense. Vayivan, so God built from the rib, he built the whole human being called the female. According to the opinion that Tzela is a side, the word Vayivan is not so clear. What did he build? She was already there. She's a complete side. Adam is one side, and Chava was another. So that's where the commentaries, they all talk about this, what it means exactly. In Chassidus and Kabbalah is very clear, because either way you have to build out Malchus. Because Malchus on its own is more of a concealed state. There's so much potential in it, but it's not completely revealed, or at all revealed. Okay. We'll continue.
What happened with David? David did not have anything. That means there was a need for him. He was the Malchus, but he needed the oil to express it.
Gave him 70 years. We learned that on the previous page.
But he was David. That means
David,
that
he was a bar nafla on his own. He would not have lived. But Adam gave him 70 years. What are you asking?
No, that means he gave him the oil. The bar nafla, but he was the source for everything. He was the Helam, but he needed the oil. I'm asking.
Well, he needed the years. Let's start with Pashat Begashmis. I mean, David deloy have leishnin rakod mishnas le ayin shem b'chin zayin tachtene shebechachma, because less lamegam al klum. I'm not sure what you're asking exactly. I mean, that's the concept of it has nothing of its own. It has to receive it from somewhere else. And when it receives it, yes, there are deep restraints in it, but it needs to receive either through Zah, Mashpia, or from Avodah, Mamata, from the Shamas, like he said. We're going to learn more about how it receives. Meanwhile, that's what he said so far. So let's continue here. V'zehu gamkein she'inyan hamerchav hu b'bchinas malchus dafke. Okay, now keep in mind the paradox here. Malchus, on one hand, doesn't have anything of its own, but within it lies concentrated, very deep levels. Zah is the other way around. It's very expressive and revealed on its own, but it doesn't have the etzem quite like Malchus does. So now he says, this is also why the concept of expansiveness, merchav, you say something is merchav, anani b'merchav, expansive, width, rechev, is the level of Malchus dafke. U'kamoshe kosov, harchivi mokem hayalecha. Expand the place of your tent. Mokem hayalecha. U'kamoi prozes teshuv Yerushalayim. So it says, Yerushalayim will sit open. Prozes means now there's a wall that surrounds Yerushalayim. Prozes teshuv Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim will dwell with open walls. Prozes. The walls will open up, meaning expansiveness, like Harchava. A wall contains something, limits it, or protects it. And Prozes teshuv Yerushalayim is it expands, that it's not contained by boundaries. So all this is referring to Malchus. Yerushalayim is Malchus. Ayalecha is Malchus. So he says, Yesh Leimer, Rebbe Rashab adds, the Zah, hu b'chinas kav, he b'chinas kav, hayin b'chinas eirech. Zah is the level of a kav, the Vav. In Yud Kei Vav Kei Zav, the 6 meters, the Vav. What does a Vav look like? A line. A line is a transmission. A line is always like a pipe, a channel that takes from higher to lower. That's Eirach, the length of the Kav. Kav, ein B'chinas Eirach, the level of the Kav, which is length. Malchus is B'chinas Shetach. And Malchus refers to Shetach, the space also that expands in length and width. So there's an expression, Nekuda Kav Shetach. You may have remembered from volume 1. Nekuda means everything starts with a point. Kav is the length, it extends into a line and then into a plane. In mathematics, the first thing you learn in geometry is what? That there's a point, a line, and a plane. So a point is the dot. Many points create a line, and many lines side by side create a plane, a space. So you have a point that has no length and no width, then you have length, and then you have width, and expansion, and that's called Shetach. Nekuda Kav Shetach. So here we talked about Malchus is Nekuda. Zoe says now is the Kav, the length, and the Shetach, which is the area. Another way of calling it is the area. An area is width and length. He says that is Malchus. And what is the pasuk coming to tell us? And that's what the pasuk said. That today the shetach and the rechav is limited. What?
Not oiholecho.
Oyolech. Okay. Okay. And the future, the shetach and the rechav, the space and the width will be Ein Sof without limits. That's the osad of it. But today Malchus is obviously not in that state yet. So the question is, the discussion, so how does Malchus have that capacity? That's even greater than Zoh. So he says, since Malchus is rooted in Atzmus, that's higher than all Gilui altogether. It's higher than any form of expression and revelation and awareness and consciousness. So Davke there is the expansiveness, the merchav that's unlimited, Ein Sof, without a limit, without end. I'm going to explain what that means in a moment. I'm going to explain it right now. Let me just see. Yeah. Okay. So very, I would say it's a little brief and dense, these ideas here. So it needs a little explanation, and I'm going to do that now. The interesting paradox is another paradox that is this. We usually think in terms that when something is revealed and expressed, it's superior to something that's concealed and hidden. That's how we think in those terms. But the fact of the matter is, every form of expression has parameters. That's why it's called expression. If someone speaks, there's a certain amount of words they're going to say. The sun gives off light. Yes, it's very powerful light, but there's a limit to light. It's not like endless. It's not Ein Sof. So the mere fact that something is expressive and revealed doesn't necessarily mean it's unlimited. On the contrary, expression by definition means it has parameters of how it expresses itself and when it expresses itself and in what form and fashion. Now, yes, there are things in existence that are minuscule and don't seem to have much. And in many ways, you could say, okay, it's a smaller form of expression. You know, think of a child will say something in 1 or 2 words, and a scholar will say something in hundreds of words. So in that sense, of course, the scholar is superior to the child. But then there's another type of nekuda that is not smaller than the expansiveness. It's actually greater. It's all concentrated there, but it's concealed. So to the naked eye, it looks like just a dot. But if you think about it, that dot, that point, can have more potency than all expression altogether. I mean, look at it from a scientific point of view. There was a time where size mattered. A stronger army meant more soldiers, more bodies, more artillery, more weapons, and the larger, the more powerful you are. Today we know that it's not in numbers. If you have the right weapons, even if it's minuscule, a nuclear weapon can be much smaller than a big bomb and the biggest armies. Yet it carries potency in it that's far, far more powerful. Before they knew there was DNA or cellular, subcellular structures, or for that matter, subatomic structures, we thought what we saw was the more powerful thing is the larger it is, the more powerful it is. Today we know that the greatest power lies in the invisible, minuscule, in the microscopic, in the microscopic. That in one strand of hair, if you create a nuclear fission or fusion, you can destroy the whole world. So what does that tell you? That there's expression through revelation, through power. No one's denying that, but that is always going to have a limit. If you want unlimited potency, it's actually in the smallest package. So when it comes to Ishtalshalus, the Eibishter made it that way. Remember, he wants to have a dira b'tachtenim. Tachtenim, by definition, is concealed. That's how the Alter Rebbe explains in chapter 36 in Tanya. Tachtenim doesn't mean the lowest, physically the lowest level, the lowest floor. It means tachtenim begili or behelim elokushi yizbarach. It's the most concealed. So you would think, okay, it's the lowest of worlds, and yes, in the world of revelation, it is the lowest. It doesn't have anything close to the divine revelation of Asiya, Ruchnius, Gan Eden Tachten, Gan Eden Elyon, Atzilus, higher than Atzilus. But on the other hand, there's an etzem that God embedded in existence, like he says in the Geras HaKedah, Siman Chaf 20, that in the Yesh HaNivra, which is far more inferior and lower than the Oyer, than the Ayin, than higher worlds, in it lies the Yesh HaMiti, that only Hu Levada b'Yecholte, b'Keicha b'Yecholte, only Atzmus can create something that has a feeling that it has no source. He explains in chapter 20 there in Ageres HaKedah, that's Malchus. That's why the earth, which is far lower than the heaven, you think, where would have the power to create Ein Sof, vegetation that continues to perpetuate endlessly? You think heaven should have more power than earth, and yet is the lowest of earth, the very earth we walk on, that we consider to be the lowest part. Daimim Tzemeach Chaim Medaber, where's Tzemeach grow from? The earth, from the lowest level, because in Malchus lies atzmisdike powers. Number one, that can never really be fully expressed if you put it in the world of Giluyim, because Giluyim can only express that much. That's why we say that in silence, you have more power than in words. The Gzeyar says that the Kohanim who served in silence in the Beis HaMikdash was a higher level than the Leviim who served with song. Now, this sounds counterintuitive. When you sing, song touches the heart. It elevates us. It transports us to another time and space. If someone was sitting in silence with you, what are you accomplishing? You hear a song, it lifts up your spirits. You know, imagine if I bring him and no one sings and no one says anything, everyone's sitting in silence. However, in the world of Giluyim, that's true, and song has great power. But there's something in silence that nothing can compare to, because silence is the only keli for real Ein Sof. Because if you want the infinite, you need something that doesn't have any finite boundaries. And every form of expression, even the highest levels of Oyer, has some expression. So it's true, Oyer Ein Sof, because it's Me'ain, its source, so it also carries in itself is also Ein Sof. But the true Ein Sof that's even higher than Oyer, that's not defined even by light and even by consciousness or expression, you're going to find only in Helam, in Cheshech, in Shcheira. in the Nekuda of Malchus. So when you talk about Merchav, there's Merchav and there's Merchav Ha'atzmi. He didn't mention yet Merchav Ha'atzmi, but sometimes that's the expression used. If you want expansion, yes, you could have that in Giluyim. But if you want the expansion of Ein Sof, that paradoxically lies in the Nekuda of Malchus that has no expansion at all. So that's why the Nekuda of Malchus, being that it's rooted, like he says, Atzma Shalamayim B'chinas Gilui, Dafka there, you have the Merchav of B'chinas Ein Sof Mamish. I'm just explaining that line, which he just throws out there one line, and you could just move on. But if you think about it, in it lies tremendous amount of depth in understanding what we just said now. Now, ultimately, the goal is to have both together. We don't just want the Ein Sof Merchav of Malchus that's concentrated in a concealed way. We want that to be Begili. That's why you need both. That's why we've been talking about Tzadikim and Balei Tshuva, Torah and Tefillah. You want to have both the Gili, but also of the Etzem. And that's what he's addressing here. So Malchus, on one hand, is a Nekuda, Shcheirani, it's dark, but in it lies tremendous power, the capacity to stand face to face, like he said. And now he's explaining the Merchav, the expansion that it has, that's even more than the Gilui of Zah, which is like the Eirech, Shetach. And La'asid Lave, all this will be obviously revealed. Any questions?
I mentioned that before, but I think now it comes out much stronger. How come that the Eibishter made David HaMelech a bar naflo? Why did he need Adam Rishon? Maybe the idea is that David HaMelech was in the essence of Malchus, that there was the essence of a Merchav Atzmi, that nothing is in it. And he needed somebody else should give him this Nekuda of oil.
That's correct. And he says it more or less in Derech Mitzvah. If you look at Mitzvahs Minei Melech, he discusses there. There he also discusses another question. In one place it says that Adam gave him 70 years. Another place it says Yosef gave him 37 years. Yitzchak, I think, gave him 10 years. I remember all the... Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef also gave him years. That adds up to 70. So the question is, why did he live 70 and not 140? He discusses this idea of different levels of Giluyim that he received from different levels, from different, yeah. But that is correct. A thing that is extremely high level, that's beyond Giluyim, needs Giluyim to reveal that element, because it is an Atzmi, and as an Atzmi, it doesn't have that. It has the, like he says here, the Mercha, the Shetach, but it's not revealed. Look, I always explain this idea with a classic example that we all can relate to. Why is it that when it comes to talking nonsense and superficial things, we can talk and talk and talk forever? There's talk radio, gossip, whatever you want. People talk and talk and talk. The weather, there's a 24-hour weather channel. When someone asks you to talk about yourself, about something that's deeply rooted within you, something personal, something, we have far less words. And the deeper you go, the less words you have. And I'm not talking about because you don't trust someone to share with. Superficial things we don't care to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about their innermost feelings. No, it's not the case. Even with someone you trust, we look, many times we say, I don't have the right words for it. I can't really express my feelings. I don't have words to express how much I love you. I don't have words to express how much I appreciate what you did. What does that mean? And seemingly it should be the other way around. the more personal, the more intimate it is, the more internal, the more you should be able to express it. It's closer to you. Whereas superficial things are arbitrary. The reason is because words are containers. They're kelim. Like every container, as much as it expresses, it has its limits. You can only put that much wine in a cup. You want more wine, you need a bigger cup. Everything has its limits. So words, at some point, you run out of words because words can express things that don't have that much energy in them. That's why we created the language called metaphor, a mashal, example, or poetry, where we don't say it directly, we say it indirectly, and that can expand the containers. What is ultimately a song? Why can you express more in a song than you can with words? Because a song, the containers become even wider. So now you can express deeper feelings. But sometimes that's also not enough. So you have to go further, and sometimes just a cry, just an oy vey, a laugh, one utterance, one noise out of your mouth can express more than an entire book. Because then energy is so intense that the keli has to be very little because the keli is too small to contain so much intensity. So sometimes it's just a cry. Then we go even further. There's expression of kala deloy ishtama. Talk about Tkiya Shefer. One of the reasons the Shefer has the Tkiya Shvarim Truas is exactly that. The Tkiya is a long sound. The Shvarim are shorter sounds, but not as short. And then there's the Trua, which is very short. Because each of them express different levels of the neshama. With the Shvarim, with the Trua actually expressing the most because it can only come out like short cries. But then the Zohar says there's a kala delay ishtama, a voice that can't be heard. That's the real depth. You can't even express it in a cry. You'll see some people are, Rahman al-Islam, in a negative way, in shock. They can't even cry. They can't even express anything, complete shock. Or in Simcha, you could also have that. There's no sound at all. So the no sound has more depth than all the sounds in the world. Like I said before with the Kohanim and the Levim. Now, it's very counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. So essentially, the more atzmi, the less expression. And the more expression, the less etzem. Like he puts it in the words that he's using here, this nukuda. So Malchus is in the embodiment of this level where on one hand, it's just a nukuda. On the other hand, it has so much power in it. Now comes the process of revealing that. And that's the work we do to bring it out. But that is a critical piece. I think this example helps, what's more than an example, it helps understand how these things work. So let's read a few more lines. Shibach kimercheve rekia. That our lips will praise like the expansion of the firmament, of the heaven.
Nishmas, v'sivseinu shevach kemerchave rokia.
Right. That our lips will praise like the expansion of the heaven, of the firmament. What is that? What is this merchav? So it says elsewhere, shezehu b'chinas hashetach da'ak, the Adam Kadmon. It's talking about the shetach of Adam Kadmon. We'll soon see how that connects to Malchus. The Masha, let's see here. Oh, by the way, that's the same nishmas that talks about Beinenu me'ires kirech ulevonu ukeshemesh. 1 second.
Kashemesh v'chayoreach.
Right, it's all part of that.
והננו מאיר כשמש וכירח, וספסשנו שבח כמרחב ורוקע.
Because remember, I mentioned the mimer from the Mittler Rebbe that discusses this. I'm wondering whether he mentions this. 1 second. Okay. So he says in the parentheses, the masha'ak kail hakail. When we say that ak is like the snapshot, the expression that ak is sacred akol beskira achas. Glances at everything with one look. It's one bird's eye view of all of reality. So he says, when you say ak is kail hakel, it's not like a concentrated point. It's more than just a seed. Shetach means it's an area. Like he says, there's sefer, he glances, sefer, he looks al mabit and sees till the end of generations. Like it says on Moshe Rabbeinu that he raw at safe. What does it say in Parshas Vayelech and Brach? It says ad safe kol ha'elam, ad safe.
Ad hayom ha'acharon.
Ad yama achron, right? So it says ad yema achron, that he saw till the yama achron, which means the sea, but they say it should read ad yema achron. So he saw all the generations to come. This was also on Odom Rishon. It says that the Shenivra b'Yom Rishon, the light that he was able to see all the generations to come. Befrat dafke. In other words, it's not just you look at a point and you don't really see details. You see the details. And yet, all the details you see in one snapshot. So the way it plays itself out over the generations, that's actually living through history each day, each year, each generation in its place, in its time. There's a nekuda achas where everything's concentrated in a dot, but you don't see anything. And here you're seeing it all in one snapshot, but it's not just a concentrated point. There's a shetach. There is a vision here. It's just like when you stand on top of a mountain or you're on a plane and you see the whole earth, or the pictures that they sent from the moon, you see the earth from outer space. It's not a nekuda. You see the entire earth. However, it's in one look. You see it all in one look, in one snapshot, not in small. When you live on earth, you can't see the earth that way. It's only when you have a bird's eye view. But a bird's eye view, he's saying, is not a dot. Yeah, if it's far enough, it'll only be a dot. But you could see the entire earth and even its details in one snapshot. So ak is not just a nekuda, he's saying it is a shetach. So we say, okay, that's the shetach. V'yidua shezo b'bchinas machshava agduma da'ak. And it's known, this is the machshava agduma, the primordial thought of ak. When we say, like in Hayem Yem, he brings that hashgacha pradis, that every leaf, when it turns in the wind, was conceived and envisioned. Hashgacha pradis, machshava agduma da'ak. It means that God had a snapshot, a bird's eye view of all of existence. And that's what this shetach is. Ukamoishin is boily ill. The aku b'chinas hascholas ha'isavos. That ak is not outside of it, the beginning of creation. So therefore, you already have a snapshot of all of existence. However, it's a snapshot. It's one glance. It's one look, one picture. But in that picture, you see it all. So he's explaining why it's called shetach of ak, not nekuda. Sha'shetach hazeh u'bchinas ein sof. This shetach in ak is considered the level of ein sof. V'zeu she'omer kemerchevei harakia. That my praise from my lips is like the expansion of the rakia. What are we referring to? K'mo yal derech moshel harakia mischalik l'shin samach milas. So we know that the Rakia, the heaven, the firmament, divides into 360 levels. Hari Ayin Beis Chalkus Milas Mamish. So it's not actual like levels, like you say, 360 floors of a building, stories in a building. It's not actual miles. So on one hand, it's a shetach, has 360 levels, but it's far more, it's in a level that's higher, that does not have the distinctions that actual space has. Like in the world of Ak. You have one snapshot of it all, so there's no distinctions, even though the details are there, but in your look at it, you see it all as one bigger picture. I think that's what he means. Same thing with the shetach, the space of Ak is not in a form that you actually see his chalkus. It's not actual levels. They're all there, but they're all in one picture. So that's why it's a level of Ein Sof. What's not clear to me is why is chalkus and Ein Sof, since when, just because there's no chalkus, why is it Ein Sof? It's still 360. So fine, it's conceptual levels. It's abstract levels. Ak, at the end of the day, is seeing everything in existence. Everything in existence is limited. So I think he means by Ein Sof here, not that it does have unlimited levels. I think he means Ein Sof that it's not defined in a structural way, meaning it's expansive. Like he says, merchav, kemerchav, harechav, what do you call merchav harakia? In other words, Ein Sof here doesn't mean literally infinite. I think Ein Sof he means here that it's not defined by structural pieces, because you're seeing everything like a bird's eye view. I think that's what he means by Ein Sof here. Which then questions what he said before. He said that Recha Malchus is Ein Sof, but Ak is Ak actually Ein Sof. So Chassidus talks about Ak as Ein Sof b'shem hamushal, meaning it's relatively Ein Sof, but it's not actual Ein Sof. I think that's what he means now. So let me explain what I just said here. I know I'm thinking out loud here. Yeah, look at the next line. So clearly he means Ein Sof, not mamish, because merchav ha'atzmus is mamish Ein Sof. So what does he mean by Ein Sof here? So I think what I just said is the pshat, but let me elaborate a bit more. When you live on Earth and you travel, everything is definitely defined in time and space. It takes 12 hours to travel to Israel, 11 hours to travel to Israel. It can take whatever, 20 hours to travel to 18 hours to Australia. Because you're living in a place of space, and space takes space, and that's that. That's not called Ein Sof, obviously. That's a gvul, limited time and space. Today, for example, when we use technology, and you can watch an event happening in Australia simultaneously, instantaneously. So you can't call that Ein Sof, but on the other hand, you can call it relative to the structures and parameters of time and space. It's a certain element of Ein Sof, because you don't have the limits of time and space as we always were limited by. So similarly, when you have a snapshot, if you were able to see all of time and all of space, whatever, God showed it to you. God showed Adam Arishan in Gan Eden. He showed him everything that would happen and everything in space. Similar to what I said before. Let's say you're outer space and you get a snapshot of the entire, all the galaxies and all the universes and so on. So on one hand, you're seeing existence, and existence is clearly structured. But you have the capacity to see it in a way, what he's calling here, Ein Sof. It's not Ein Sof mamish, it's not infinite in the sense, because it's still looking at the world, it's looking at existence. But it's seeing it not with the parameters that you usually look at things. So one of the explanations I once heard to explain Ein Sof, what's called Ein Sof Bahashola, or Ein Sof Mamish. When you say something is, let's say, the Gemara says about, God forbid, the dinim of Aguna. So if a husband gets lost at sea, so if it's a river and he's not found, so you assume that he got out at the other end of the river. You don't assume that he drowned. It says, however, by an ocean, Mayim she'ein lahem sof, it says, the Gemara says, there, the opposite. I'm sorry, the opposite. By an ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, it's controlled Mayim she'ein lahem sof. Why? Because it's very possible he got out somewhere else. The ocean is so vast, no one saw. In a river, I believe the din is the other way around. Because it's small, if you don't find him, you're assuming that he drowned. Because someone would have seen him. But an ocean, because Ein Lahem Sof, he could have gotten out anywhere. It's so large. Now, how could the Gemara call it Ein Lahem Sof? The ocean is very large, but you can't call it infinite. Compared to a river, it's larger. Yet the Gemara uses that expression because from a point of view of human beings, it's infinite. It's beyond our scope for us to be able to contain that type of amount of space. That's why it's called so overwhelming in a way. So example I once heard for this, I think it comes from the Chassidim of the Rebbe Rashab. Now, when you look at the set of numbers in the mathematics, you say that a unit, number one, and trillion have something in common. They're finite numbers. Even if it's trillions, even if it's zillions, or whatever, how high you want to go, it's still not infinite. Then there's the infinite set of numbers, and compared to the infinite, one and zillion, trillion, and whatever the numbers may be, are equal. One. How could you compare one to a billion, or one to a zillion, or one to a trillion, or to a zillion, and so on? Because infinite, true infinite, is beyond one, and the largest number are still units. They're very distant from each other, but they're still finite. So you could say, in human language, you could say, it's like infinite when you say it's zillions and zillions, because compared to one, but you can't really call it true infinite. In numbers, the set of numbers infinite is real infinite. There is such a thing called the infinite set of numbers, the infinity. But it goes further. If you were to ask infinity, does the number one mean anything to you? Infinity will say yes, because I'm in the world of numbers. The number one is in the world of numbers. I'm infinite, so I'm infinitely distant from one as I am from a zillion. However, I can't say it doesn't exist. We both are in the world of numbers, except this is finite and this is infinite. If you're asked a level where numbers don't matter altogether, talk about Eid Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, or Atzmus for that matter. For Atzmus, even the fact that there's nothing in common with the set of numbers. So in other words, what the finite number one is lacking is in what it's not. It's only finite and not infinite. But you can't say that what it is doesn't have any value in the eyes of the infinite. It has value. So then there's a level of bittul that's so deep that even what it is doesn't have any value. So infinite and finite, both of them are completely nullified in the presence of something where numbers don't matter altogether. In a world that precedes numbers, a world that's outside of the world of numbers. So the way they explain is that's the difference between, I think the Rebbe Rashab actually says in a mimer in Pasach Eliyahu, Tofesh Nun Ches. I think he uses somewhat of an example like this. So what do you see from this? That Ein Sof can be seen relatively. Ein Sof Mamish is so Ein Sof that everything is nullified, meaningless. Ein Sof that's not Mamish means, for all practical terms, infinite set of numbers is infinite compared to the finite. Even a zillion compared to the one unit can be called by somebody, it's so big, I call it infinite. What he's saying here is that Ak is a combination of one hand, it's in the world of existence, but it's so-called an infinite look at existence. But it's not Ein Sof Mamish. Merchav Atzmus is already a higher level than Ak. That Ak is still after the Tzimtzum. It's a snapshot and a glance, a picture of all of existence in an Ein Sof way, not limited by defined parameters. And then there's a level of Mamish Ein Sof. That's what he's saying here. The point here is, I'm only explaining what he means by Ein Sof, and that's the difference between Ischalkus and Ein Sof. The bottom line he wants to say here is that the Shetach, that we're talking about, we're talking about that Ak has an element of space and area that is a taste of Ein Sof. And that's what means the pasuk receives the Lashon and davening receives Sosenu Shavach Kimerchevei Rakia. That our lips praise Kimerchevei. What's Merchevei? The expanse of the Rakia, the expanse of Ak. It's a form of Ein Sof. To come back, we'll soon discuss how that applies to Malchus. So that's Ein Sof. Shashed b'chinas Ein Sof. Okay. So like the heaven, yeah, it's Kamoi came b'chinas Shadam b'chinas Chavos the male b'chinas Ein Sof. But Kol came b'chinas Hamerchav da'atzu shu b'chinas Ein Sof mamish. Ukamoi anoni b'merchav yudke. We say mina meitzer karosi yudke. Anoni b'merchav yudke. Answer me with the expansiveness of Yudke, b'chinas merchav ha'atzmus. That's the expansiveness of Atzmus. And why is that? And how do you get there? And that comes due to the fact that you cried from your distress. Remember, mina meitza, the nekuda, that's choshech. There's no giluyim at all. The non-giluyim are able to reach the expansiveness of Atzmus. The distress or the strain or of the soul, that's the nekuda atzmis, the core source, the core root of the nefesh that has no giluyim at all. This is the tshuva that comes from the inner core of nekudas alev. No ispashtus, there's not expansion at all. It's coming from a very distressed place. You feel very pressured, distressed. Hazozes atzmusi means its very core gets shaken. This is called tzaikas alev, the cry from the heart. Like it says elsewhere, shemagia primius va'atzmus ein sof. That dafka has the power to reach the core, the inner and the core of Ein Sof. The Meitza Lamata is the distress below, the Nekuda, complete darkness. And what's Meitza Lamaila? The Meitza is so-called, Meitza means confined, limited. Meitza Lamaila and B'chinas Atzmus Shalamayla Meged Gil Legami. That's the Atzmus that's high, that's completely higher than any form of revelation. So distress, darkness below, that's beyond, lower than revelation, reaches beyond revelation. And that means karasi, that you call out from the inner and the core. It should come, you call, and kriya comes from word calling and drawing down. From there comes the response from the merchav, from the expansiveness. Not merchav that's finite. We're not talking about an expansive place. We're talking about something that's beyond any form of structure. Merchav atzmus mamish. And the inyan of merchav here, the expansiveness, is higher than any confined, the confinement of a keli, of a container.
So what is mina meisal korosi? B'chinas pnimius ha'atzmus of me or of the Eibishter? It's sound of me.
Mina meitzer korosi kof, from my distress, malchus nekuda, where I feel completely trapped and confined and distress, that reaches the merchav atzmi, the meitzer lamayla. Okay, but still not clear, which he's going to clarify afterwards. So 1 second. On one hand, you speak about a Nakuda that has no expansiveness at all. It's completely concealed. On the other hand, you talk about Shetach and Merchav that has expansiveness to the point of expansiveness, infinite expansiveness. So what fits where? So the answer is that he's going to explain that we're talking about combining a few things here. Because Shetach in general, you could say is Giluyim. Expansiveness means something is expanded. It's not a Nakuda. And yet he said Zah is the level of Eirech, of length. So there is extension. But if you want the real Ein Sof expansiveness, you have to go all the way to a place of below anything that's expansive. So basically, you have to say there's a Shetach in the world of Giluyim. There's a Shetach in the world of Ak, which is like Ein Sof. And then there's a Shetach or Merchav Atzmi in a world that's higher than Giluyim altogether. And yet, that too will come inside of a Keli. That's what he's going to say next in the next section here. So it could be a little confusing, but that's the end of the day what he's coming to say here. I'll read it inside. Omnam b'chinas merchav ha'atzmus yesh leimer. The expansiveness of atzmus compared to other levels of expansion is yesh leimer shezeu shegam agbolas hakeli yeh b'chinas ein sof. Not just beyond the container, but the very container should be in a form of ein sof, like we learned earlier. Kamoy b'teira she b'chinas tam b'seichel. Like we see by Torah. It's defined by parameters, tam v'seichel. It has an intelligence behind it. There's reasons. Torah is not just, has no parameters. Torah does have a structure to it. Tam v'seichel. Shezel b'chinas hagbola. K'neida. And kagbola, rather. U'k'neida, the chol b'chinas seichel v'asaga, b'hechach u'b'chinas hagbola. As it's known, any idea and comprehension has to be in some form of parameters. That's what comprehension means. You understand an idea, a certain structure. He doesn't say miniyam, he just says rechava, that the Torah is aruchem eretz midah. It's longer than the entire earth, and rechava, and wider than what says afterwards, than any sea. But the point is, it's longer and wider, which means a hainu shekol inyan. That though the Torah does come packaged in structure, but fundamentally it's beyond structure. Every Inyan has a merchav blik vol mamish of unlimited expansiveness. The eina kavon al riboy haprotim shebekol Inyan, and the intention is not that the Torah has endless ideas. It's not like there are many details in every Inyan that you can keep digging and finding more and more and more. That's not what he's saying. That every detail, being that it's not a man-made structure and creation, every detail is really, has within it, essentially, it's concentrated bligvul in gvul. That's what Torah is. Like we learned about the shir atzmei b'keir, that in the infinite possibility, it's infinity packaged in the finite. Commission is barely ill, as we learned earlier. Be'inyan hamadida the Torah, about the measurements of Torah, the parameters of Torah, she'bli midah. It's without parameters. Remember, we learned about mokem ha'aron eina min hamidah. Ukamay mokem ha'aron, like the space of the aron, the ark, eina min hamidah. You measured it; it was measured, but it was also not. It didn't have measure. Ukamay hamadida the man, like we learned also the medida, the man was food. Lechem min hashamayim. It had substance. It had taste. It was measured. And yet, it had an element that was not measured, that had no element of structure. It was beyond structure within structure. We learned this earlier. I can give you the page shortly. The Nim said, the B'chinas ha'atzmus u'lamayla meged the gili. So what do we derive from all this? He's going to now conclude that from Atzmus is completely higher than any form of revelation, expression, definition. And if you want true expansiveness that's unlimited, you have to go to the Atzmus that's higher than Gili, because Gili at the end of the day has its parameters. Ukamoi kenu b'chinas Malchus. And similarly, and so too it is with the level of Malchus. She b'chinas nekuda be'etzem, b'chinas helam. It's be'etzem, it's fundamentally, we said, remember, emanated like a nekuda, a point, which means a state of concealment, shcheida, darkness. Because it's rooted in Atzma Sein Sof that's higher than any revelation. And that's why in the future, when in Malchus will be revealed, its root, its core root and source, that's when Malchus will be an increased state of expansiveness, Ein Sof Mamish, unlimited. Malchus the Chol Nekuda hu b'chinas helam. 1 second. Malchus the b'chinas helam, the Chol Nekuda b'chinas helam. I'm trying to read that. I'm not sure the flow exactly. Let's see. I guess it means that it'll all be revealed in the Helam of Malchus.
Malchus היא בחינת הלם, the whole nekuda היא בחינת הלם. Every nekuda is בחינת הלם.
Yeah, but he said that 2 lines before. What's he adding? Okay, the language, it's not the Havana is clear. It's a state of Helam, because every Nikud is Helam. Like we learned at the top of the page in Zayar, that's the state Shcheirani, that I know is in that Helam will be revealed all this Etzem, canal, the state that I am dark, concealed.
Why does he say kol nakuda? There's only one nakuda in the Helam Ha'atzmi. I'm sorry, in the Rishimu. I thought there's only one nakuda. Nakuda Sa'atzmi. So
where do you see the word Rishimu?
well, I don't see it, but I thought he was alluding to that.
No, not necessarily. Kol nakuda means every point is a state of darkness. A point, by definition, every point, no matter what it is you don't see any expansion. There's no revelation. It's just a point. That's what it means.
So he's saying that every point is going to open
Yeah,
up.
but he said that already 2 lines before. I'm just wondering why he's adding, what's he's adding here. It could be that he's leading to the next section.
Before he just says that Malchus is.
Yeah, but what's well, the sentence doesn't read so clearly. I don't see the.
I said.
What does it mean? What's the end of that sentence?
Yeah.
As I said, the understanding is clear. I just talked about the linguistics of it.
Yeah, I got it. The teretz.
It could be he's preparing for the next section, the next paragraph, I'm thinking.
No, it's readable. It does not explain why it's repeating. The whole nekuda b'chinas helam. That's why Lo'osit is Gala b'Malchus b'chinas shloshom kiro atzmi tia b'chinas.
I'm thinking that really it should be read like this. 4 lines. I'm going to read the last 4 lines again. U'kamoy kenu b'chinas Malchus b'chinas nekudas be'etzem b'chinas helam. And the same thing is with Malchus, which is a nekuda be'etzem, fundamentally a point in a state of concealment, because it's rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof. And this is a parenthesis, like, parenthetically. And he's just saying, as an aside, and La'asid will be revealed in this Malchus, will be revealed its source, Mercha b'Yeser. And then he's continuing what he began before by saying, in other words, if you skip the line of La'asid till Mamish,
Yeah, that's the right way.
That's, I think, how he's reading it. So, yeah.
I think you're a better editor than the editors of this publication. I think you figured it out.
He added here the last 10 lines, something very powerful about the Merchav Atzmi, Ein Sof, that even the Agbola Sakeli is also part of the Merchav Atzmi, because the Agbola from Mitzvahs, from the Torah, are not Agbola.
Right. I think that an important point to emphasize, and I'll elaborate on the next shiurim, on the next classes, is this. The interesting thing is like this. It's not the pshat that when Mashiach comes, la'asad loveh, we will see the quality that was concealed within the helem of our lives. Or in other words, in the nekuda of Malchus. But you could say today we don't see it. Like Golus is very difficult, very challenging, a lot of distress, talk about the distress of the soul. And today we're told that within it lies the etzem. And the Asad Lave, it'll be revealed. It's a lot more than that. The moon is not going to remain a nakuda. It's not going to remain a point. The moon is going to shine in full glory like the sun shines today. Except it's going to be the energy of the makabel of the moon. In other words, why is he making such a big thing about the merchav here? Because he wants to say it's not going to remain concealed. It's always going to be rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi, but we're going to have both, the best of both worlds, the best of Giluyim and the best of Etzem. Today, the Etzem is concealed, and the Giluyim are not the Etzem. The Giluyim are like the sun, the Mashpia, the Zoh. It has expression. It's beautiful, but it's not the Etzem. L'asad Lave, you'll have the best of both worlds. You'll have Merchav, but it'll be Merchav Ha'atzmi, because it's going to be coming from the Nakuda that ultimately reached a place that's higher than any form of expression. And when that gets expressed, it's an expression that's Mamash Ein Sof. I think that's a very critical point that he really, I think, is the real punchline here, that he's really coming to add. Even though more or less was said earlier, but he's saying it in different words now. I think that's a big key point here in this whole discussion.
Maybe this is what he is continuing, and the next very powerful. Maybe that's what you said now.
No, for sure, because as I said a number of times, we learned this, we discussed at length. Why was created in the first place? If the Yesh and Malchus and the Nakuda has everything, why do you need And we learned at length because is the expression of godliness. At the end of the day, Nakudas HaMalchus may have the etzem, but it's not expressed. So for sure, that's why he mentioned Rishima before, that the Nakudas Rishima has the etzem, Helam Asmi, but it also has oyer that's concealed in it. And the other way around as well, the oyer also has the power of the etzem in it. That's why a tzaddik also is going to have tshuva. So a tshuva will have the quality of a tzaddik, the oyer of a tzaddik, and the tzaddik will have the keli or the malchus of a bal tshuva. That's ultimately where it all comes together. Yeah, very good. Pretty powerful stuff. Yeah.
I have are you asking for questions yet? Or
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
So it says Mina Meta Karasi Yaka. Then we're going to reach out to Mirchav. There's Mirchav Atzmus, the Rebbe says here. Then there's Mirchav Blik Vul Mamish, the Rebbe says here.
Yeah.
And I want to know if these two levels of Mirchav, Atzmus and Blik Vul, is this that relative Atzmus, which we're talking about in like a level of Ak? It seems infinite because of zillion infinite, but it's still within the category of numbers. Or is it true Atzmus, Atzmus itself, Mila, higher than Tzimtzum Rishon, higher than Ak, the ultimate Atzmus? Are we getting up that level?
That's a good question. My answer is the latter. He's talking here even higher than Ak. The reason he brings Ak, my understanding, I was wondering myself, since he's talking about Merchav Atzmus Mamish, he says clearly, look, he says the line, well, Koshkem b'chinas HaMerchav Atzmus shu b'chinas Ein Sof Mamish. So I was wondering, why does he bring Ak then? Why do we need to know about Merchave Rekia? Because I believe what the Rebbe Rashab is trying to teach us is you can't just jump to the highest Merchav. First, you have to get to Merchav at least relative Ein Sof before you get to Ein Sof Mamish. So the answer is both. Ak is not the highest level, but Ak is definitely higher than the structure. That's why Ak has, it's like you can't see things completely from the bird's eye view of Atzmus if you don't first see things from the bird's eye view from the top of the mountain, like Ak is. You see what I'm saying? You first have to get a taste of Ein Sof relative, that you see all of existence in a snapshot, all time and space. That's why Ad Marishan was shown that, Moshe Rabbeinu was shown that. And then that can lead you to the next level where you come to a place that's completely expansive, that, as you said, even beyond the set of numbers. So I think he's talking about both, and each one has a quality that the other doesn't have. Remember, seeing it from the perspective, seeing Ein Sof, like, look, we look at the world and we see a bunch of pieces. Then suddenly you have a taste. You look at some beautiful scene of nature and it blows you away. You're in awe of a wonder, one of the natural wonders. What's the mile of that? That even in existence, you've tasted a little Ein Sof. Like when you see the redwood trees, or those other, what are the other big trees there in the West Coast? You know, Yitzchak isn't far. Sequoias. So the Rebbe once said in the Farbrengen, Yud Shvat, I think in the early mems, he said, why do we only find these big sequoias and the redwoods only in this hemisphere? You don't find such trees anywhere in the other hemisphere. So the Rebbe said, because Matan Torah was not revealed in this hemisphere, the Eibishter wanted to give us a taste of Ein Sof. The Rebbe said that. Isn't that interesting? So he wanted to give us a taste. So you see those trees, they're awesome. Obviously, they're not Bli Gvul Mamish. They do have a height, but when you look at them in context, you see such a tree. It's really awesome. You go up to outer space, you hear the astronauts that looked at the Earth. So in Gvul, you're getting a taste of Bli Gvul. Then, once you have that, you can come to a point and say, oh, you want real Bli Gvul Mamish? That's the Merchav Atzmus that really Malchus is rooted in. So the answer is both, and they're both necessary in our growth.
Great question, Eliezer. Where did the Rebbe say that about the giant trees? That's so cool.
Yeah, I spoke about it. If you look in my life, Chassidus Supply, just search redwood trees or something. He said it twice. He said Yud Shvat. I quoted exactly where it is. I think Yud Shvat Mem Beis, maybe 1982. But look at do a search, you'll find it pretty easily. Okay. Should be easy.
All right, thank you.
In the topic that we spoke before about the Ak, it comes out, you explained it well, but
I just want to say one more thing, one more thing before. That's why we say when we say in Shema, V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, chol nafshecha, b'chol moedecha. Why don't we jump straight to b'chol moedecha? And why moedecha? With all your might, with all that beyond you, because it has to first be beyond you before it's beyond everything. In other words, you have to climb b'chol levavcha with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha with all your spirit, all your faculties, and then b'chol moedecha, even that which is beyond you, but it's still you. And moedecha, moed shalcha, and then you can come to a moed amiti, which is like merchav atzmi, completely beyond. But you have to go. First, you have to experience awe and be blown away in your world. Maybe that's why there's an infinite set of numbers, actually, before you get to the real infinite that's completely beyond numbers altogether. I like that. That's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I started to say about in Ak that he said there are two things in Ak. There's the Shetach and there is the Nekuda HaKeileles. So he said that the Shetach is Sefer Mabit Atzev Koladeres, but there is also Kulon Niskorim Biskiro Achas, and this is the Atchola Seis Avos. The Shetach is not the Atchola Seis Avos, it's above that, it's a Merchav. But the Nekuda HaKeileles is already...
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Because he does say in the beginning of the parentheses, Because he says the Masha Akol Hakol Einze Kamoy Nakuda Akelelos.
But he also said, "Umikol mokoim kulam niskorim biskiro achas." There is
Yeah, but
concluding
Skira Achas, I explained, is not Nakuda Achas.
as cholas eisavus.
One second. I explained it differently. The Nakuda Achas is not Skira Achas. Nakuda Achas is one dot. Skira Achas is one picture.
What is the
Hold on,
shetach?
that's how I'm telling you how I explained it. And what he means by Scholas Isavus is that's why he's saying it, because Ak is already part of creation. That's why you have it's in the world of creation, you have a shetach. He calls it shetach of Ak. He doesn't say that's it's another discussion. Is there an element on Ak that's like an akuda, like in Malchus, that's pure point? From here, it's mashman not, but you could argue that there is an akuda in like in anything. There's a point and then expands, but he doesn't seem to suggest that here. Here he seems to be suggesting that he's not talking about an akuda. He's talking about a picture. It's one picture, not like it is on Earth where it's all broken down into details. That's how I understand it.
How would you explain Nekuda Akilalis? He said that.
He says it's not Nekuda Kalelis. That's what you're reading.
I'm asking, what is Nekuda Akilalis?
It would just be a dot. You wouldn't see anything in it. It's like a pure dot that you see nothing. A picture, you see all the generations. You see all of time and space. It's like the astronauts on the moon. They saw the Earth. They see the whole Earth. It's not a dot. A dot means there's nothing to see. It's all like a seed. You don't see in a seed anything. That's how I understand the piece.
On that point, I had a question. When you were talking about that, is this to say that our neshama is trapped? I mean, it's mamish feeling.
When you say mina meitzer karasi ka,
right?
It's a sentiment that I'm calling for my distress.
Right.
That's the verse. David HaMelech is
course.
saying, mina meitzer, from my distress I call out to God. So.
Oh no, I got that. My question is that only when someone is in a distressed place, or is it the neshama is always essentially always? I get that. My question is,
if you don't feel distress, you're not going to cry out with distress, right?
Well, you can be distracted. The question is whether the soul is always in distress. That's my question.
You have to ask the person. I mean, my understanding is you call out from distress when you feel distress, not because it says so in the books.
True.
Look, we learned earlier about tshuva coming from distress, hitting rock bottom. You're not going to cry out unless you feel pain. There are people, I know many people are in distress and they think they're happy.
Yeah, but you're making my point for me.
What's the point?
That this neshama is always in distress when it's in this world.
It's not relevant to the discussion here because mina meitzer is an active behavior of someone crying out.
Yeah.
It could be. So what? So if the soul is in distress and you're not aware of it, what's going to happen?
Well, I don't know. I was looking for a predisposition for like depression. Someone who's been inclined toward depression maybe is in closer touch with the distress of their neshama. You know.
But then they're aware of it. You're talking about they're aware or not aware?
Well, I was suggesting if the soul is always in distress.
Anyway, listen, mina meitzer karasi ka is a very clear state.
Oh, yes, I agree. Yeah.
The person's crying out from distress. That's what he's addressing. Whether people are in distress when they don't cry from distress is another discussion. I don't see it relevant here.
Well. But he calls it, or whatever. I don't. It's a nuance, an important one, but I'll let it go. It crossed my mind that maybe the neshama is always in the meitzar because it's stuck in a body. And the fact that you call out from that place is a time when you're in connection with that.
That's not what he's trying to say here.
Okay.
If you want to go back to where he spoke about this in more detail, you have to go back where he spoke about the cry of a soul. Back a while back where he spoke about this in detail.
Okay. It just crossed my mind. I certainly understand the shot of it. It's very clear. It's one of the most beautiful.
Is the Rebbe
Okay, so let's
implying?
stop here at the end of the paragraph.
Okay.
By the way, I did not say that every soul that comes down to this world, by definition, is in a limited place compared to the neshama above. We said even tzaddikim down below don't have the same level of avodah as it is above. There's no question every soul does have, there's more constraint and more distress here. But out here, he's talking about the active process. Okay, we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph, bottom of page 1358. Somebody else wants to say something?
Sounds like Eliezer or something.
Huh?
No, I think when you turn off Eliezer